You're listening to Sweet Talk, all things maple. Welcome to another episode of Sweet Talk. Today's topic is cleaning. End of maple season cleaning, to be more specific. Cleaning may not sound like a lot of fun, but what we do now to clean up from this past maple season will have an impact on the success of next year's maple season. I thought it would be best to bring in a seasoned maple producer for this topic, and who better than our guest, Nick Wendel. Nick is part owner of the family operation Wendel's Maple & More in Western New York and is a maple equipment dealer for H2O Leader. But before we listen back to that conversation, we'd like to introduce a new segment to the show. Going forward, we will answer one of your listener-submitted questions on the start of each episode. To hear your question answered on air, go to www.cornellmaple.com and click on the Sweet Talk Maple Podcast button. On the Sweet Talk page, you will see a place to submit your question under the words Ask a Maple Specialist. We look forward to answering your questions. So let's jump into today's question. Listener Matt asked, in episode 40 with Joel Bouton, around the 40-minute mark, you were discussing the two biggest mistakes people make when tapping. I'm unable to make out the second mistake. Something along the lines of needing two of something. What is he saying there and why is it important? I don't use vacuum. Thanks, love the show, and especially the ones like this with actionable information. Well, Matt, thanks for the question, and thanks for listening. Since English is not Joel's first language, it can be a little more challenging to understand at times. Joel's from Quebec, and French is his first language, but he has such useful information for producers. Now, the first mistake Joel mentions is making sure you tap in the correct place on the tree. Making sure you are tapping into good, clean wood and not into old compartmentalized wood. The second piece he mentions is to keep two hands on the drill. It's important to make sure you have good footing and keep both hands on the drill for stability and to keep a good round hole. If you only use one hand on the drill, you're more likely to create an oblong-shaped hole as the drill wobbles, which can have sap leak out around the outside of the spout. And on a vacuum system, that can be a potential vacuum leak. So I hope that helps clear things up, and thanks for submitting that question, Matt. And with that, let's move on to my conversation with Nick Wendel. Hi, Nick. Welcome to Sweet Talk. Thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks, Adam. Appreciate you asking me.
I imagine you finished up from a successful maple season in Western New York. At least the reports I have heard from your area were good overall. Are all your spouts pulled yet?
Yes, that's one of our focuses. When we get done making syrup, our focus is get the woods cleaned first. With weather and heat normally at the end of the year, that's the first to get kind of growing into weird things. So the faster we get that clean, the better.
Yeah, I think I would agree. There's usually not a particular order that we always follow, but usually pulling spouts is step number one. And we know from testing that replacing a spout each year will usually give us at least 50% more sap the following year. So I imagine you are replacing spouts. But question for you, when you're pulling spouts, the end of the maple season, are you cutting off the old spout now when you're untapping, or do you do that later?
So we actually, when the check valve adapters first came out 15, 18 years ago, whenever that was, they were set up as an adapter to go on to like a stubby spout. And we stuck right with that through and through. For us, it makes a lot more sense when we're tapping that we just carry the adapters with us. We drill, pound the adapter in, put the stubby in the adapter. It's one less tool that we have to carry with us. And then it's also one less step. For our schedule, it never seems like we have time to go push spouts on in November, December, before the snow gets deep. So it seems like we are adding our spouts while we're tapping, and the adapters are just easier. So we use an adapter stubby system. It seems that there's a lot of customers around that are seeing that. We're selling a lot more stubbies as it goes on. It's a preference thing, though. If somebody wants cut off spouts, that's perfectly fine. But I really like the stubbies and adapters myself.
Yeah, and I think we should preface here that, everyone has their own techniques for doing things. So what we discussed today may not be the only way. It's, there's different ways of doing things.
Exactly. If what works for some people, honestly, the research a few years ago that showed that you could push on spouts or replace your spouts in December or even early January without having ill effects on production was huge. That if I couldn't get adapters, I knew that I could. But just with our the turkeys for Thanksgiving of our family poultry farm and stuff like that. I don't have a lot of time in the late fall when I should be out there. And then holidays and shows and everything else that happens, it never seems like I have the time to do it, but it does give that opportunity to a lot of people to do some maintenance and some pushing spouts on in the late fall or even early winter.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. One question I have for you that I hear from some producers with the stubby spouts and the adapters is they don't think they're always sealing as well with good vacuum.
A lot of that has to do with, I believe, how you're set up for attaching and removing stubbies. So what happens is you struggle to get stubbies and adapters apart one year. That leads to the next year that you're not setting them all the way, and then you end up with loose stubbies. Having the correct puller or separator tool makes all the difference, that you are going to tap that stubby twice with a small hammer. And I can honestly tell you that this year I did all the repairs on our woods, and I don't think I ever had a stubby push off at all. And we had a fair amount of cold weather. Deep freezes are what pushes spouts out, push lines apart in some cases. And we had plenty of cold this year, but I didn't have any stubbies push out of the adapters. And even with the wind and branches that we, had leaks caused by that, if a drop line got yanked on, it yanked the spout from the tree. It didn't yank the stubby from the adapter. So I would have to say, set correctly, stubby and adapter joint is not a leak problem at all.
That's good to hear. And I mean, to me, they make a lot of sense instead of having to push on new spouts. It would make tapping a lot faster if that's when you're pushing on new spouts. And so I've actually played with them a little bit this past season, some different adapters, just because I've been more curious about them.
And your drop lines never get any shorter.
Yep, for sure. The topic that a lot of people are often thinking about, but unfortunately there's not really a good industry standard, at least for here in the US, is cleaning tubing lines. So what's your thought on this? Do you clean lines?
I do. Unpopular opinion with a lot of the industry, especially larger producers, is they don't clean their lines. Part of my background, so family business here beyond Maple, is a poultry plant. So we process birds once a week under state inspection, and then I supervise a USDA inspected plant that I see an inspector every single day. So my life evolves around shiny stainless, you know, in every minute of the day, it feels like, whether it's stainless tables and trays and racks in the poultry processing equipment or in the maple. So I have an unhealthy addiction to the shiny stuff. But it also means that, especially with the poultry, we're worried about E. coli and salmonella and stuff like that, which we are very lucky we don't have any of those problems in maple. But it's just instilled in my head. You clean, you sanitize daily. And with the maple in the tubing system, we're obviously not going to do it daily, but I feel like once a year, even that's almost uncomfortable sometimes, that we go an entire season without washing it. And then at the end of the season, not to wash it just doesn't feel right for me. I know the research, the production doesn't show that there's any sort of difference to wash or not to wash, but that's typically quantity based, not quality based. And it's very hard to research the quality from year to year. You get temperature differences, everything else. But for me, we still wash our tubing. When we wash we will actually wash with vacuum. We don't push our water up. So we'll carry a pack, like a backpack sprayer. We gut all the pumps and stuff out of them, so they're just a tank. And then as we pull our taps, we'll suck a small amount of whatever we decide to use for a cleaning solution that year. And we've changed around a lot over the years, but we'll suck a small amount down each lateral line from each tap, and then rinse the main lines. We actually rinse the main lines first and at the end. And we've found that, I can't say, from a quantity or a quality standpoint, I notice a huge difference on the quality of the product that we're making. I know that I feel better about it. The biggest gain that I've found is that the big run after the first big hard freeze of the year, when most people see all that grimy crud come down out of the lines after the ice scrubbed it clean, I don't have any problems plugging pumps or, screens and extractors or releasers or anything like that. My lines are a whole lot cleaner to start the year, and just makes me feel better, I suppose.
And one could argue that I think you bring up a really important part is that quality aspects. That quantity may not be changing all too much, but that quality of the syrup. And so one could argue that if those lines are cleaner, your quality is probably going to be better, especially when we get some warmer weather, like later in the season.
Absolutely.
And I've even talked to some producers who do clean their lines and find that they make less sour syrup near the later in the season before it kind of goes buddy. Like I think this year we had a lot of producers, even for my own, where my syrup started to be sour before it actually went buddy. And I think it's because there was a lot of grime in those lines, even though I do try to clean my main lines, but I'm clearly not cleaning them enough because I was getting a lot of that grime built up at the end of the season when it was really warm.
Yep. I don't think, I mean, especially on a warmer season, you're never going to stop all of it. But if you can keep it at bay, especially in any underground lines that you may have, those lines don't see the deep freezes. Those lines don't see the intense temperatures in the summertime that actually may kill bacteria. Those underground lines stay at a beautiful 55 degrees that grow bacteria like crazy 365 days a year. Those are the most important ones I think that we should be focusing on sanitizing, even multiple times during the summer just to keep it at bay. But all the lines obviously make a difference, I think.
Yeah, for sure, but definitely those underground ones. So you mentioned you've tried a bunch of different kind of cleaning solutions. So what is your current method of practice?
Current method is using somewhere between 120 and 150 ppA of peracetic acid and hydrogen peroxide. We're using a product called hydroxysand from Hydrite Chemical Company, and we've seen very, very good results with it. In the past, other methods that I were using, I'll give the hydroxysand an unfair advantage because we have been using it with permeate. And I think that's an important part of this line cleaning situation is that you're using permeate when you're cleaning. A lot of well water, a lot of, whether it's a spring or a creek or whatever you may be getting your water from, may have things like algae and stuff growing in it that may not make a big difference when you're just hosing floors down, but in your tubing system, it's going to grow more. So using permeate, I think, is important. And then some sort of sanitizing agent. Definitely don't recommend using, sodium chloride or Clorox or anything like that because squirrels just love that salt.
Yep. Have you tried the calcium hypochlorite, that calcium kind of bleach, which is kind of like a pool shock, but there's a food grades for food surface sanitation?
I have not because honestly, I didn't know there was a food grade version of it up until this point. So you just said that. I thought there was only your pool level versions of it. I have not yet. Part of that is I don't like any residue left in my lines. And to me, that's the beauty of using a hydrogen peroxide based cleaner is that over a fairly short period of time, and it's a month or two, at the most 3 months, that hydrogen peroxide breaks down to basically pure water and free oxygen. So residue is not a problem at all using that cleaner.
Yeah, we might have a little bit of vinegar left behind from the peracetic acid, but that will rinse out in your first run or
Very
whatever.
quickly.
Yeah, yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, there is I think Drytech is the brand that makes it's a powder of the calcium hypochlorite, the calcium bleach, which I have. I think the hydroxysand, the peracetic acid, and hydrogen peroxide is a good option potentially as well. I will say that there is a little bit of pause now with chlorine cleaning solutions. In Quebec, they're actually recommending not to use chlorine anymore for cleaning, and that's because in Europe, detection limits for chlorine in food products is much, much lower, and they've detected some on the maple syrup, so they're trying to limit. In the recommendation in Quebec, it hasn't come out as an industry standard to limit chlorine, but it's something that we want to be mindful of, that when you use something like that, and I think even the hydroxysand that you're using, that first run really should be dumped. It shouldn't take much, but that first run the following season, if that is your rinse for cleaning those, a lot of those do require a rinse.
Yes. And the one other thing that I'd like to bring attention to, and this is common in our food industries, and it goes with other things also, is you don't necessarily want to use the same chemical just year after year after year after year after year. You want to have a little bit of a change up in there. And that's what I'm currently looking for something. We've been on hydroxysand 5 or 6 years now. I would like to about every fourth, maybe fifth year, switch to something different. And that's, something to look into the sodium hypochlorite or whatever another option that once in a while you switch to something different, not that whatever we're fighting gets tolerant to the chemical you're using. So even in the poultry plant, we switch up sanitizers, once a week, every other week, just to make sure nothing gets tolerant.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I think it's important we've making sure that what we're using is labeled for food surface contact, and it should actually be labeled for a porous food surface. Even though sap doesn't drip out of them, they're technically, plastic is porous because there's all these little micropores.
Absolutely.
Unlike your shiny stainless steel.
Yeah, and stainless lines out in the woods, they're not going to make sense yet. So
Yeah. And I think also just important to say for our US listeners that isopropyl alcohol, which is commonly used in Canada and is approved for use there, has not been approved for use in the US here, and so should not be used. But the industry is working on trying to hopefully get that approved for use in the US. So we're kind of hopeful that maybe within a couple of years, but there's a whole process that we have to identify a manufacturing company to go through the approval process through EPA, and there's got to be some data that the company needs to acquire that can't just come from researchers. So there's a whole process, but the industry is working on that. So we are hopeful that maybe in a couple of years, but for right now, we should, in the US, hold off on using isopropyl alcohol.
Yeah, I like a lot of people that do use it up north speak very highly of it, and I look forward to having it as an option here in the States. But until then, we just have to hold off.
But I've also talked to a producer out of Quebec who has used the hydroxysan for cleaning and has found that he's able to get his lines just as clean as like new tubing, like using isopropyl alcohol. So isopropyl alcohol works great, but it's not like it's the only option out there.
And I think, like I said before, anything with a rotation where you're using yearly something different, it's good to have options for a rotation like that. So
Yeah.
if it's a viable option, you have an option to change.
Yeah, for sure. So let's move on to reverse osmosis cleaning. I hear a lot of discussion from folks about, not pulling their membranes from the machine and storing them in the MBS, the sodium metabisulfate, the preservative that usually is recommended for storing. Instead they run water through them once a month or so. What's kind of your process or recommendations or thoughts on reverse osmosis, end of the season cleaning, and then storage of the membranes?
So end of the year cleaning obviously is going to start with whatever cleaning regimen that you're looking to do. I guess there's two main camps on this is, do I send my membranes out, let somebody else worry about getting them clean, buying all those extra chemicals and stuff like that, or I'm going to take care of it myself. Now, out here in Western New York, we're a long way from Vermont, Quebec, wherever those membranes are actually getting cleaned. So there's a lot of transport that you got to worry about, owning the membrane housings, stuff like that. So there's some people that do it, but I don't think it's a easy option out here. Myself, I've never been a fan of pulling membranes out of housings if you didn't need to, simply because there's O-rings that get pinched, there's connections that can leak. If it's not leaking, don't mess with it. You risk dropping them, cracking it, and anything that goes along with that. So I'm in the camp of leave them in the machine, wash them in the machine, do that job myself, and not have to worry about making sure I got my specific membrane back because, they got mixed up at the cleaning facility or the factory or wherever. The big piece of cleaning them myself, though, is keeping enough permeate. You've got to have enough permeate around to do a cleaning regimen. And basically what happens at a factory type cleaning setting is they're just going to regimen soap, rinse, acid, rinse, soap, rinse, permeability, and just continue that process until they stop seeing a gain in flow rates and it's as clean as they can get it. We can do that in-house with commercially available, cleaners that any dealer will sell you. But you have to have enough water to rinse in between. And, rule of thumb, 50 gallons per 4-inch membrane is a minimum, 300 gallons for an 8-inch membrane minimum, and then however many rinses you think you're going to need to do is how much water you're going to need to keep. So that's your first step, is making sure you're storing enough water. And I think something to apply here is using a tank farm example of having multiple tanks that you may use for sap most of the year. But at the end of the season, when the sap flows are starting to get smaller, you start stockpiling, using some of those tanks for permeate to be able to store more at the end of the season. So having that permeate's important. This is something that I think everybody should be doing all the time, but obviously desugaring your machine, some people don't realize the amount of concentrate they're rinsing out in the ground the very first rinse before your rinse. But desugaring your machine, pretty simple to do, takes just a few minutes, but a lot of people are rinsing concentrate on the ground. I hope it's not as many as I think, but every year I talk to one or two that, oh, I didn't know that. So, that's a first step, I guess, in any cleaning. And with rinses, you should be using permeate only. If you run out of permeate, rather than rinsing with well water or creek water, I would rather see you make more permeate out of said well water. When you clean your membranes, they are pristine, if you will. You don't want to be rinsing them with any sort of mineral or anything else that has a chance to stick on there. So rinsing only with permeate is another one. Soaps, there's a lot of different options out there for soaps. There's liquid, there's powder. Whatever you are comfortable with, I recommend. Powdered soaps typically are just your raw ingredient. They do a good job, but it's very easy to get a little excessive with them because they're just the raw ingredient. Liquid soaps typically have surfactants in them that help the soap work better. They'll have builders that help the membrane just life-wise. They'll also have typically a buffer in them. So if you happen to slip and overuse a little bit, it's not going to hurt the membrane pH-wise. Most of the time, check with your membrane manufacturer on how high of a pH you should be doing in a soap wash. H2O membranes target a pH of 12. Different membranes might be different, but most membranes I've found are between 11 and 12 for pH. How to check pH is certainly different camps on that. Also, I don't mind pH strips myself, only because, which I know they can be unreliable and not very precise, but the alternative for a sugar maker and only using a pH meter for an RO is an electronic meter that you're going to use for a month and a half or 2 months, and then it sits for 10. And they require calibration with buffer solutions and stuff like that can be troublesome, where pH strips, they may not be as precise, but they're going to give you a reading without all the trouble of a faulty digital meter because you haven't used it in 10 months.
So yeah, if you didn't store that properly or calibrate that correctly, it's going to be probably more inaccurate than the pH test strips.
Exactly. So if you have a pH meter that you're using all year round in your maple kitchen for barbecue sauce or mustards or whatever you're making value-added products, by all means, stick to that, use that tool more often, it'll be fine. But, if you're only using it for your RO, double check pH. And you don't have to necessarily double check pH every single wash. Once you find how much soap you need, you're good. But do keep in mind that the pH of our permeate can change throughout the season, and you may need a little more or a little less soap depending on what the pH of your permeate is. After any soap wash, obviously do a rinse. If it's the end of the year, you want to do a regimen yourself, you follow up with an acid. Acid's going to be very similar to your soap wash as far as, adding the acid, doing a rinse up to heat, whatever your machine wants to turn off at. Acids, depending on the acid, can be left to soak for a little while, which I think is good to help remove that scale. pH, again, we're looking for between 2 and 3 most of the time. H2O membranes recommend a pH of 3. Don't mix the two together, acid and soap, just because, well, I only have enough water for a rinse. I'm going to go mix them together. You're basically just going to equal each other out. They'd be completely ineffective if you're using both of them together. So don't mix them.
Yeah, that's also not safe chemically to be doing that by any means.
No.
And just to clarify for people who may not know, so the acid is helping to dissolve like mineral scale that's built up. Think about if you got hard water in your house and you get that like white calcium kind of build up. So the acid dissolves that, right? Where the soap that we're doing is a high pH of like 12 is for killing the microbes, right?
Exactly. So soap is going to remove any organic material, your dirt, your microbes, your bacteria, anything organic that's in that membrane that's going to help remove that type of stuff. But it's going to leave behind the scale, the mineral that's embedded on your membranes, much like the sugar sand on our pans. And that's where the acid comes in. Now, acid is always going to be more effective on a cleaner membrane. So that's why we would start with soap, do a rinse, than do an acid. The one thing that I would like to touch is that acids, although they can dissolve the mineral, they can't always carry it out the way we would want a rinse to carry them out. Quite often, those minerals just stay in a granular form and they're somewhere in the machine, stuck in a fitting or a pump or something like that. So typically, I like to follow an acid wash with another rinse and then another soap wash. And the soap wash is going to grab onto that material and carry it out. The other thing is that during an acid wash, you are contracting the membranes. They get stiff just because of the low pH, and they won't always flow quite as well as you expect them to after a wash, but a soap wash brings that suppleness back. You mentioned different chemicals for different things. A chemical that not a lot of people are going to use and is an option is a sanitizer in a membrane. So our soaps should help us with, organic bacteria and microbes and stuff like that. Acid's going to help with the scale, but sometimes they get embedded in there different types of viruses and stuff like that, that when we hit them with the high and low pH, they basically gel themselves up to protect them. And that gel just plugs the membranes and they won't flow at all. We lose a lot of our flow rate. So using a sanitizer such as an Oxy Plus from Leader H2O or hydroxysan in the right proportions can help kill that bacteria and get it out of our membranes. So that's also can be added to your regimen. Typically, if you're going to do a regimen, I would do a soap, a rinse, an acid rinse, an Oxy Plus wash, which when you do that, you're only going to want to go to about 70, 75 degrees and let it soak. A rinse, a soap wash, and then another rinse, and check your permeabilities to see how clean your membranes are. And realistically, that's the cleaning regimen that most of the big cleaners are going to do for you anyways. If you can do it in-house, you don't have to worry about getting your membranes back.
Yeah, I think those are great points. I don't usually send my membranes out either, just because, they're doing that same regiment that I can do of that soap to acid, back to soap, and keep going back and forth, always with a rinse in between. I don't usually always do as big of a rinse that I would do, like, say, at the end of a soap wash and I'm getting ready to run it again through more maple sap. Sometimes only run it a rinse for 15 to 20 minutes or so instead of where it would normally be over an hour to fully rinse everything. I don't know what your thought is on that at all, but
Absolutely. If I'm between chemicals, you can just kind of check your rinse. If you're between chemicals, you can only need to rinse until your pH is neutral. So check your pH of your permeate, which should be around 7, but it can vary a bit. When you reach a neutral pH of your rinse water of your permeate, you can go to another chemical. So you don't need quite as much in between chemicals. But you're absolutely right. At the very end, when you're trying to make sure you're completely free of your last chemical, definitely you want that full 300-gallon per 8-inch membrane rinse at minimum. And you can never over rinse a membrane either. You can't hurt it by running extra water through it. You may be kind of wasteful if you're just letting thousands of gallons rinse through it. And that's one thing. If you're in the middle of a season and you got some extra water and you want to make sure, I'm just going to rinse it through, but I don't have quite enough for another chemical wash. A hot water wash never hurts a membrane either. Realistically speaking, what's removing contaminants from our membranes is realistically the heat. When your machine shuts off at 105, 110 degrees, whatever it's set for, the temperature is what's expanding the membranes and releasing the dirt, the mineral, whatever might be embedded in it. The soap's just there to help carry it away. So sometimes even just a hot water wash where you set up just like your soap wash, but just let water recirculate, let permeate recirculate, you can loosen up some of that stuff and rinse it out with just a short rinse. You don't need the full chemical rinse to get rid of it. So that's a nice aspect to add in the middle of the season. If you got time, extra water, you're in the sugar house cleaning pans or something, let the machine run through a hot water wash and then rinse out your extra water before a freeze or something like that.
yeah, that's a good point. And one thing I'll also add is that if you are for some reason short on water, you can get by with, if your RO is set up where you can drain the membrane vessels instead of pushing it out with the rinse water. It's more like having a 5-gallon bucket filled with soap water and you're just keeping adding water in to try to rinse that out. If you can dump that bucket and then put in water, it takes a lot less water to rinse them if need be, but it's a little more challenging to do that at times.
Absolutely. Rather than diluting the entire mass of the machine constantly, yes, you're right. If you
Yeah.
can dump that, it does make a difference. your original question on end of storage over the summer, you're right. There's a couple different options out there with chemicals in the off season. If you're storing membranes in the housings, we've had pretty good luck with some of the chemicals. If you're storing them in the machine, though, I'll admit that I've not been impressed with many of the chemicals that I've tried over the years. And I have gotten on the camp of just rinsing periodically once a month, every 3 weeks, just rinsing for 5 minutes or so, just pushing old water out of the machine, new water into the machine, using permeate. The one thing I'll stress if you're doing that, though, is a closed tank for storing your permeate. Open top tanks are open to the air. There's a lot of bacteria and stuff in the air. Doesn't seem to last as long. Any closed tank seems to do a better job of storing permeate for a long period of time, like over the summer.
Yeah, and if you do that method, I think that's important that you are doing it, once a month or so, not just forgetting about it for 6 months and making sure you have the permeate that you can do that.
Yep. One other recommendation, if you're storing membranes within a machine in a chemical of any sort, is to swap out your pre-filters before you unplug the machine or turn the breaker off or whatever you're going to do for the long period of time. Pre-filters tend to harbor any sort of bacteria and grow it very effectively. I normally just remove them and then hang a sign on the machine that no pre-filters. You can just add dry pre-filters back and it's fine, but take your pre-filters out. Even if you only use them for rinsing the machine, take them pre-filters out and toss them out. It helps with bacteria growth.
Yeah, no, they can certainly get nasty. So I think just to reiterate that, it's important to probably talk to the manufacturer of your specific RO and your membranes as well, because some of the preservatives that you put in, like some machines won't recommend that for putting that into the actual RO membrane. They want you to pull that out and put it into a separate housing, because some of those preservatives are not great on some of the O-rings and gaskets and things like that, can break it down that may be inside the machine. So some companies I think are okay with you doing that, some are not. So it's good to talk to the manufacturer.
Absolutely.
So one of the last piece, probably my least favorite thing to clean, is the evaporator. What's your kind of quick tips that you have there?
I am definitely, it's one thing we prolong. Like I said, when we get done at the end of the year, we hose the pans out, we'll fill them full of permeate, and between getting the woods washed first, priority, and then we buy bulk syrup, we end up buying syrup for the next, weeks, if not months. It feels like the pans get forgot about, and it's, like you said, it's not my favorite job. I do love seeing the pans nice and shiny at the end, but it's, a lot of elbow grease in some cases just to make them look that way. I've had good luck with just time. Using the right chemicals in the pans seems to make a big difference, to just letting time be in your favor and let the chemical work to an extent. We're using a cleaner now from Hydrite. The number escapes me at the moment, but it's a phosphoric and a nitric acid. Both of them are perfectly safe to soak for a long period of time, where you can let time work for you on that. The one thing I'm going to recommend against, there's a lot of sugar makers who are farmers and they're going to grab the pipeline cleaner, which is meant for stainless, and use that in their pans. Typically, pipeline cleaner is going to have sulfuric acid in it, which, although it's a great acid to remove scale, if you leave it in there for a long enough period of time, it will darken, it will stain your stainless pans. So if you're going to use that type of cleaner, time's not recommended, short period of time. The other thing that I found extremely effective for helping chemical to work is a little bit of warmth. Used to years ago recommend simmering the pans just for a very, very short period of time, and found that that's a little too warm. 150, 180 degrees max. Warm them pans up a little bit once in a while. Seems to go a long way with letting the water molecules move around and do some scrubbing by themselves. Seems to make a difference. The other thing that I'd like to, people don't realize sometimes, is that acid, when you're cleaning pans, especially a long soak period, it's not just about the pH that we're cleaning at, which pH in a pan typically somewhere in the low twos is what I'm going to recommend. You can maintain a pH of 2 and the pans may just stop getting any cleaner. It may not erode any more off. And basically what's happening is the cleaning solution becomes saturated with mineral. And I can't remember the numbers, but this actually can be, you can watch it with a hydrometer, oddly enough, and you just need to swap your acid out. It's not that the acid's not working anymore, it's just it's full of mineral. So sometimes, a rinse and another soak might do a better job of removing off what you need to.
And just to clarify, the line cleaner that you did not recommend using is like a milk line cleaner, not a maple tubing line, correct?
Exactly.
That's it. Okay.
Yes. Yep. When that milk line cleaner is used, typically it's used in a very short rinse. So, it's set up and it recirculates for 15, 20 minutes. I'm not a dairy farmer. I couldn't tell you exactly, but I know it's in there a whole lot less than a few hours because they got to milk cows again. And, so it's in there for a short period of time. It's meant to be effective, short and quick rinses, where we are sometimes letting it sit for a few days, even a week in some cases. You want to make sure you're using the right chemical for a long soak like that.
And would you recommend reaching out to your, local equipment dealer for different chemical options for pan cleaners?
Absolutely. And some of the stronger chemicals, I don't think there's a lot of folks out using any soldered pans anymore, but there are still a few out in circulation. Sometimes they're newer soldered pans from an Amish tinsmith or something like that. A lot of the new chemicals do not work very well. I take that back. They work great, but they're not solder friendly. Solder should be short period of time, just a few hours, get the scale off your pans, a little more elbow grease, and don't let that solder see the chemical for very long because it will eat the solder out.
Yeah, that's definitely not what you want in your pans for any reason. So those are all great recommendations. My final question for you is, what excites you about the maple industry? What keeps you working in the maple industry?
So I'll tell you that for myself, I'll be 40 here in the fall and been involved with maple my entire life. I mean, my first sugar season, if you will, is just a few months old, basically in a car seat type carrier and out the sugar house with mom and dad because that's where they were. That's where I had to be, and just grew up with it. And to me, the innovation that we have seen in the last 30 years that I've been paying attention is absolutely incredible. I mean, for example, one is an RO. We bought our first RO, or Dad did, roughly the year 2000. At that point in Western New York, there was only a few people using it. We were the minority by a lot. And it was one of them things where you're almost ashamed to say that you used one. People questioned, well, does it still make good syrup? And again, minority. And today I could have a group of customers in my store, 4 or 5 different, sugar makers, if you will, and they'll be chatting with each other. And the one little hobby guy that doesn't have an RO, we look at him like he's got, something wrong with him,
Yeah, hasn't thought through it
The
all.
people, and when you look at equipment, for instance, like the Leader Micro, the RO bucket from Carl Nyland, those tools have brought reverse osmosis to hobby producers, even small hobby producers, to where non-RO users are the minority by a lot now. And to see that happen in the last, 25 years is really, really cool. To me, I think the next version of that is steam evaporation. I don't think we'll ever get to a point where a majority of people are using steam, but I think serious maple producers that are, really concentrating on efficiency and their time usage. When you look at the time to clean a steam evaporator versus, a conventional evaporator, what's your time worth doing that cleaning? And if you're making a couple hundred gallons, a few hundred gallons of syrup a night, or even 1,000 gallons, you're going to have to clean more often. The steam rigs are just, the control is better, less risk of burning syrup, ruining syrup. I think steam is going to be a much more accepted process in the future. I think there's a lot of variables that go into quality per se, but I do know that we've tasted plenty of steam syrup here ourselves at our, when we buy syrup, and it's still good syrup. It might be slightly different as far as amount of flavor or color, but it's still good syrup. I think there's an application for it in this industry without a doubt. And it's interesting to see what the future holds for it. I also think that different processes using steam might be in the future. We may not see them as commonly as the rigs we see now, but I think using steam is certainly going to be the future, and it's going to evolve, and we're going to be able to get the flavor and the color that some of us may look for in our product out of steam. And I think that's going to be exciting.
Yeah. If you look at, most modern evaporators outside of the steam or even electric evaporators, but whether they're wood or oil fired, like the design really hasn't changed in 100 years that much.
No. I mean, there's little improvements. You look at max pans and steam aways and air injection and stuff like that, but realistically, it's just conversion of surface area over, heat over surface area, and that's it. But this steam application, which isn't necessarily new, I mean, people have been boiling with steam for 100 years probably.
Yeah.
But the application of it into maple is, really starting to get exciting.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. It's just the industry in general and the changes that are happening is exciting time to be part of the maple industry and the growth that's happening.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Nick, thank you so much for joining me for Sweet Talk. This has been a great discussion. It's great having you on here, and hopefully we'll have you back on in the future.
You're very welcome, and anytime I'd be happy to help you.
Thank you. Well, have a sweet day.
Thank you. You too.
Thank you for joining us for Sweet Talk, all things maple with Aaron and Adam. Sweet Talk is produced by the Cornell Maple Program and is made possible with funding from the New York State Maple Producers Association and the USDA Agricultural Marketing Service. All music is obtained from Blue Dot Sessions. For more information on all things maple, visit cornellmaple.com. Have a sweet day.